Irina Gaidamachuk was born on September 26, 1972 in the city of Karpinsk, Sverdlovsk region. Soon her family moved to Enyagin, Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug. Irina grew up as an ordinary child. At school, she did not stand out in any way, and after that she entered the university at the Faculty of Law, according to other sources, at the Faculty of Psychology. Soon the student became pregnant, got married, and after the birth of her daughter Alina left the institute. However, Gaidamachuk did not become an exemplary mother. She got carried away with alcohol and often went into binge drinking. Her husband initially put up with this, but a few years later he kicked Irina out of the house with the child. Then she handed over her 6-year-old daughter to an orphanage and continued to drink. In the late 90s, Gaidamachuk met Yuri Kuznetsov, a resident of Krasnoufimsk. He worked as a driver in a bank and came to Nyagin on a business trip. They broke out. Irina soon became pregnant and decided to move to her lover in Krasnoufimsk, without having issued a divorce from her first husband. After a while, the couple had a daughter, Nastia. According to the memoirs of friends and neighbors, Gaidamachuk was an ideal mother. She took care of her daughter, took her to school by the hand, and was on the parent committee of the class where Nastia studied. But when the girl finished elementary school, her mother, I got carried away with alcohol again and eventually drank the money that the class had collected for a holiday in honor of the end of the school year. This trick of Gaidamachuk turned into a terrible scandal. The common-law husband struggled with Irina's alcoholism as best he could and tried not to give her money so that she would not buy alcohol. Then Gaidamachuk, under fictitious pretexts, began to borrow money from neighbors. But they quickly saw through the deception and stopped sponsoring Irina. At the beginning of the noughties, Gaidamachuk began to earn extra money. She whitewashed ceilings in apartments of Krasnoufim residents and knitted things to order. She had money, she distributed debts, and now she was buying alcohol at her own expense. And in 2002, Irina began hunting for pensioners. According to one source, the reason—
Hey, I'm not going to beat around the bush. You have to subscribe to the channel and like it so you don't miss new videos.
was her hatred of the elderly. They say, they have outlived their time and their continued existence was meaningless. Most likely, Gaidamachuk broadcast her conflict with her elderly mother-in-law to them. She constantly swore with her drinking daughter-in-law and harassed her in every possible way. According to another version, Irina decided to kill for profit. She knew that old people collect funeral money or keep pensions at home. Anyway, Gaidamachuk's first crime was spontaneous. She whitewashed the ceilings in the pensioner's apartment on Ukhtomsky Street, and at some point decided to rob the hostess for the sake of money for alcohol. But at that moment, when Irina was searching the room in search of valuables, an elderly woman entered there and made a fuss. Gaidamachuk grabbed a hammer that was at hand and struck the hostess several blows to the head. They turned out to be fatal. After the killer took the money from the deceased and went for vodka. Since no one knew that Gaidamachuk was doing repairs at the pensioners, it was not possible to detain her in hot pursuit. After the first crime, the woman continued her bloody path. She left the house ostensibly for work, and she went in search of a new victim. On city streets she tracked down another old lady, followed her home unnoticed, and a little later knocked on her door under the guise of an employee of the fire service, housing department, or social worker. Sometimes, on the eve of the visit, she left a note at the front door of the future victim with a request to be home at the specified hour. For example, this: "Dear residents, please be at home on May 5th in 13 hours. At the same time, Gaidamachuk was able to win people over. Her second victim was extremely suspicious and tried not to let even her neighbors in, but the criminal managed to talk the old lady, and she, to her misfortune, invited Gaidamachuk to enter. Some of the victims treated the maniac with tea before his death. And if they didn't call her to the table, then Irina herself asked to bring her a glass of water, and then, after making sure that the victim was alone at home, she took out a hammer. Gaidamachuk attacked at the moment and the landlady turned her back on her. The maniac covered the heads of the pensioners with pillows and went in search of valuables. The criminal's prey was food from the victims' refrigerators, gold jewelry, and often very modest money, usually about 1,000 rubles. Only once, Irina found 16,000 from the deceased. And sometimes the maniac left the crime scenes with nothing at all. The pensioners hid their savings so carefully that Gaidamachuk simply could not find them. So that the bodies of the victims would not be found for as long as possible, the killer, leaving, locked the doors to their apartments, and lonely pensioners were really not immediately grabbed. In some cases, the maniac tried to set fire to the apartments of the murdered pensioners. When leaving, she left an iron-on or a lit candle. But the fire never happened. At the same time, sometimes she spent the whole night in the apartment with the murdered victim. For example, in the winter of 2008, in one of the houses on Mayakovskaya Street, Gaidamachuk dealt with an 80-year-old pensioner, and then sat in the kitchen until morning and wrote the lyrics of Beatles songs on scraps of paper. Gaidamachuk made the first and only misfire in February 2003 with the third victim, who lived on Sovetskaya Street. Then the employee of social protection attacked the pensioner right from the doorstep, as soon as she opened the door. The frightened hostess, whom the criminal managed to hit several times on the head with a hammer, began to scream loudly. Her neighbor ran out to the noise, and Gaidamachuk ran away. Fortunately, the wounded pensioner not only survived, but was also able to testify. She remembered that she was attacked by a blonde in a faux fur coat. Soon, according to the victim, the sketch of the criminal, which was pasted over all the streets of Krasnoufimsk. The leaflets were accompanied by the call, "Citizens." Never in the history of Krasnoufimsk has there been such a series of brutal murders. The time has come when all of us, residents of the city and the district, must unite against the killer. Signs of the criminal: a young woman 160 to 165 centimeters tall, slim build, blonde hair. Only by joint efforts we will be able to stop and detain the murderer. However, the law enforcement agencies of Krasnoufimsk at that time were not completely sure that the killer was a woman. According to one version, the criminal could be a man in disguise. But nevertheless, the search for the mysterious blonde continued. Almost all the fair-haired residents of the city were interrogated. However, by that time, some of the blondes of Krasnoufimsk hurried to dye their hair dark in order to avoid unpleasant conversations with the police. Then the detectives decided to en masse fingerprinting the townspeople. Their addresses were found out through the passport office. The procedure made sense, because the suspects' fingerprints were found at the crime scenes, but the search did not lead to anything. After the arrest of Gaidamachuk, it turns out that she, having moved to Krasnoufimsk, left her passport in Nyagin. It was a pledge for borrowed money. Therefore, she was not registered in Krasnoufimsk and actually lived in the apartment of her lover Kuznetsov on bird rights. Meanwhile, one of the leaflets with the sketch was even hanging on the door of the store opposite the house where Gaidamachuk lived. But no one paid attention to the similarity of Irina and the portrait of the killer. However, even those neighbors and acquaintances who noticed the similarity could not believe that Gaidamachuk was the same Krasnoufimsk wolf. I also told her, "Look, Urka, how the sketch looks like you." She just laughed in response. Fright or embarrassment did not show on her face. As a result, the maniac dealt with pensioners for another 7 years. To disguise herself, she wore a wig and sometimes chose to commit crimes in other cities, where her dark deeds were not so well known. In just 2 days in Yekaterinburg, Druzhinino and Serov, Irina Gaidamachuk killed 4 pensioners. 2 more elderly women died at the hands of a maniac in the village of Shirokaya Rechka. And during the next attack in the village of Achit Gaidamachuk, she almost got caught by the police. The pensioner who let her into her house suspected something was wrong and managed to call the precinct officer before her death. He arrived at her house, rang the doorbell, but no one answered. At this time, Gaidamachuk was hiding inside and waiting for the victim's body to see what would happen next. After trampling on the spot, the policeman left, and the killer slipped out into the street and disappeared. For some reason, Gaidamachuk left a hammer at the scene of her 9th crime, and it became clear to the detectives that they were dealing with a serial killer. The fingerprints on the hammer were female, and the particles, the blood on the crime weapon belonged to several victims at once. After that, all the episodes of the murders of pensioners were combined into a series. At the end of February 2008, Gaidamachuk visited Nizhny Tagil and committed another massacre there. She introduced herself to the elderly hostess, apartments by an employee of Gorgaz, and she let her in. The maniac hit the woman, tore a gold chain from her neck and, pulling valuables and money out of the closet, disappeared. The victim of the criminal turned out to be the mother of the deputy head of the local police department, and all the forces of the city police were thrown to solve the crime. Already at the end of March 2008, guards detained Maria Vaileva, a resident of the Upper Tours, at the Nizhny Tagil railway station, the woman did not work anywhere and led an antisocial lifestyle. Soon Vailiva confessed to all the crimes committed by Gaidamachuk, and called their motive hatred of pensioners. According to the detainee, she became addicted to drugs in her youth, got into bad company and once became a victim of gang rape, in which 14 men participated. Everything allegedly happened in the apartment of a certain pensioner, but she not only did not help Vailiva, but also laughed at what was happening, after which Maria decided to take revenge on all the old people. The confession was very convincing, and therefore the investigators began to actively collect evidence to take the case to court. But suddenly there was a new murder of an elderly woman in Serov, and Vailiva immediately stated that the confessions were forced out of her by force. The investigators confirmed her words. As it turned out, the police used force against the girl and threatened her. As a result, 3 law enforcement officers involved in this were put behind bars, and 2 of their colleagues got off with suspended sentences. Meanwhile, Gaidamachuk returned to Krasnoufimsk and soon committed another murder there. She attacked an elderly neighbor, from whom she had previously bought fresh milk. And a little earlier, she tried to kill her other neighbor. Gaidamachuk came to her, hiding a hammer, and began to ask for a loan of 3,000 rubles, allegedly for a trip to her sick stepfather. But then the maniac was scared off by the pensioner's son, who was at home, and Irina hurried away. In February 2010, Gaidamachuk left the family. She told her husband and daughter that she was going to her mother-in-law to repay the debt, but did not return home. Alarmed relatives first looked for a woman, preparing for the worst, but soon found out that Gaidamachuk settled with their neighbor and does not plan to return to the family. However, pretty soon she moved again, to another lover. In May 2010, the maniac went to Achit Street, where an 81-year-old pensioner lived, who was destined to become the last victim of the Krasnoufimsk she-wolf. This time Gaidamachuk. I decided to repeat the scenario of my first crime and attack the landlady of the apartment, which I penetrated under the pretext of carrying out repairs. The criminal struck her victim 18 blows on the head with a hammer, but after that it seemed to her that she was still breathing. Then the killer dialed full, a bath, dragged a pensioner into it and drowned her. The body of the deceased was found by rescuers who opened the apartment. They were called by a neighbor, worried about the cries of a hungry cat left without a mistress. By that time, the policemen had lost their feet, trying to catch Gaidamachuk. The reward announced for helping to catch the killer did not help either. But then a friend of the last victim remembered. 3 years ago, a pensioner hired a certain woman named Irina to whitewash ceilings, and shortly before her death, she again turned to the whitewash for services. And they met at the railway depot, where Gaidamachuk worked as a house painter. With these data, the police were able to easily find the suspect and deliver her to the department under the pretext of fingerprinting. Research has shown that her fingerprints are completely. They matched the prints on the hammer, and Gaidamachuk was sent to the pre-trial detention center. And finally the detectives were convinced by the data of an additional examination. One of the deceased pensioners, resisting, tore out a clump of hair from her. Experts confirmed that the hair belonged to Irina Gaidamachuk. By the time of the arrest, the serial killer from Krasnoufimsk had 17 murders of pensioners aged 60 to 90 years, from whom she stole only 50,000 rubles. During a search of Yuri Kuznetsov's house, investigators found hammers, but they had nothing to do with the crimes. As it turned out, those hammers with which Gaidamachuk killed her victims, she either left at the crime scenes, or threw them into the river in garbage cans. The detainee did not deny herself for long. She began to confess to all the murders and go on investigative experiments. Gaidamachuk explained to investigators that she went to crimes only because that her husband didn't give her money for vodka. At some point, the maniac began to put pressure on Pity and declared that she was pregnant, but the medical examination did not confirm this. Experts found that the accused suffers from mental disorders, but recognized her as sane. By the beginning of the court hearings, the guards conducted about 2,000 examinations. 21 relatives of the murdered pensioners were recognized as victims, and the criminal case, Gaidamachuk, numbered 443 volumes. During the meetings, she behaved brazenly and self-confidently, refusing to give her address in front of journalists. Allegedly they harassed her family members. By the way, the maniac hoped to the end that her relatives would protect her and provide an alibi. But they only confirmed that the woman was often away from home, and sometimes disappeared for several days. The only one who supported Gaidamachuk, and even then by the nature of her service, was her lawyer. he tried to get a lenient punishment for the defendant. The relatives actually refused. They can be understood in a human way. But nothing bad is said about her either, except that she used alcoholic beverages. She still has a minor daughter. In my opinion, 20 years is a lot, the lawyer said. However, the relatives of the victims who were present at the meeting strongly disagreed with her request. The court did not heed the requests of Gaidamachuk's lawyer and in June 2012 sentenced her to 20 years in a general regime colony. In addition, the convict was ordered to pay 30,000 rubles as court costs. Gaidamachuk did not appeal the verdict. The district policeman responsible for the area where the maniac lived was dismissed from the police shortly after the verdict. Anastasia, the youngest daughter of Irina Gaidamachuk, experienced extreme stress after the unsightly truth about her mother became public. The public. She was subjected to the strongest pressure from the townspeople and ridicule from her peers. And the main defender of the girl for a long time was her father Yuri Kuznetsov, who did not even realize that he had lived with the Krasnoufimsk she-wolf for years.